The next theme that we're going to develop this afternoon is critical. When the dragon may be right. God forbid. You know. But it is going to happen to you. In this spirit, you should always beware of hyperextension of the righteousness joint. You know, you've got to be real careful about getting yourself strung out. Always think before you pontificate. If it turns out that you are wrong, it will be a long, cold way back. And the quicker you speak and the louder you speak, the longer the way back is. Therefore, follow those admonitions in Proverbs, and boy, there are plenty of them. To lay your hand on your mouth, to listen, be very slow to exert or insist upon your own integrity or your own righteousness, or, as I said, if you do turn out to be wrong, it will be much more painful for you than if you calmly in the first place just listened and thought about it for a while before you reacted. There are two critical considerations whenever you are looking at or evaluating criticism of yourself or your church or anything else for that matter. First is to consider the source. Is the source truly well-intentioned? That's going to be the first thing you're going to have to ask. And you're going to have to look carefully at this person, because the impulse is to react, and this is what we're going to try to get you not to do. Before any chance of reaction is that you sit there and you look very carefully at this person and you think a little bit about this person, and hopefully you will pray for this person, not just about, but for them, so that when the time comes for you to say something, you will have thought about it. First of all, are they really well-intentioned? Are they seeking the best interests of the church? Are they committed to the service of the church? Is this a person of integrity? If they are, you need to acknowledge that. You need to realize this is a person of integrity, and I need to consider carefully what's being said. Is this person self-aware enough to understand the issue and accept responsibility? What does that mean? Well, it means that the person is not blinded to his own flaws and his own faults to the extent that he will always point the finger and never be able to accept his share of any responsibility. If he is in that frame, you have to deal with him differently from what you will if he is a person of integrity who is self-aware and can acknowledge the fact that he may also be wrong in the process. Next, are they responsibility accepting people? Are they the kind of people who accept the responsibility for the things that they do? If they are, they need to be more seriously listened to and considered than if they are not. How many people, another question, share their criticism really? You got to think about that, because people will say, well, all kinds of people in the church are saying this. My first question always is, before I get a chance to even close my mouth, is who? You know, you think, how many? I mean, I'd like to know. But you do have to ask that question, is this really a criticism? Because, you know, that type of criticism is very difficult to deal with, because when you start asking people, sometimes even people who do agree with them won't own up to it if you start looking into it. So that's the first thing. Consider the source. Take a good look at that person. Think about them carefully. The next consideration is consider the spirit in which the criticism is given. Is it rational or is it emotional? If it is rational, you deal with it one way. If it's emotional, you deal with it another way. But you've got to at all times be careful that your own reaction is not emotional. Next, is this criticism well thought out over time, or does it result from a few hours of upset? You deal with them in very different ways. A person who has thought about it over a period of time and very carefully considered it and comes to you deserves to be heard in a different way from a person who just been upset a few hours and is spouting off. And you need to respond differently to those two different people. Is this criticism being advanced in person and in private? Tells you a great deal about the spirit. Unfair criticism is most often over the phone or in passing, just tossed at you as somebody goes by with no chance to discuss it, or it comes through a third party. Well, Mrs. Jones really doesn't like the selection of hymns that we're singing in church. You know, Mrs. Jones doesn't. So unfair criticisms will often come to you over the phone and so forth. Your best criticism will come to you eyeball to eyeball, face to face, in private. That's where the person deserves to be listened to. Is this person trying to help, or are they just carping? Because you deal with them in different ways. If a person is just sounding off and just carping and just a complainer, you have to think about that. You have to evaluate how you're going to respond to it, and you must be careful not just to react to it. And the worst thing you can do is just try to justify yourself with people who are just carping. You're wasting your time trying to explain or justify yourself to a carper or a complainer. The best thing in the world you can tell to them is, well, thank you for bringing the matter to my attention. I'll give it serious consideration. You could say, I'll give it the consideration it deserves, but that might not be kind. On this matter of the spirit in which criticism is given, you should consider hot anger a sign that something more is involved. Somebody really gets mad and really ticked off. Always assume that something more is involved, but don't go directly after it. Silence is the best defense against hot anger. Don't say a word. Justification, explaining yourself, is probably like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. When a person's mad, let them vent. One minister was listening to a man who had jumped him, was loud and strident, and had a list of grievances as long as your arm, and was just really going down a matter in an old wet hen about one thing after another. And what was really shocking, he said the man was going along, and in mid-sentence, in this long list of grievances, right in the middle of a sentence, he interrupted himself and said, quote, "She says, all I'm interested in is sex." What happened? The man was mad at his wife. And he was taking it out on the minister. Why would somebody do that, you reckon? Do you ever wonder why a person will do that to a minister? It's a very logical reason. Very logical reason. Because a minister is committed to take it. A minister can be trusted not to hit back. A minister will not tell you to bug off. You try telling this whole story that you're going through and all this mad and being mad at somebody and trying to vent your anger to somebody else, and they're liable to tell you, hey, I don't have to take that from you. Get away from me. You know that, don't you? You know there's some people you can't do that, but a minister will take it. In one sense of the word, the fact that people trust you enough to vent their anger with you or even at you is really a compliment, because they don't believe that you are going to treat them as unfairly as they are treating you. So, you might even sometime find it in yourself when somebody's really letting you have it to feel good about it for just a moment, because you don't have to feel bad just because they're mad. You don't have to get mad at them because they're mad at you. It isn't required. There's nothing that's written anywhere where you have to respond that way. Hot anger almost always is an indication that something else is involved, and sometimes if you'll just listen long enough and not answer back and not even have anything to say, the real truth, as it did in this case, will come out, that the man was having a lot of trouble with his wife. Their marriage was on the rocks. She was continually nagging him and giving him a hard time, and he desperately needed to talk to the minister and did not know how to initiate the conversation, I guess. But somehow or other, he had to get to it. Shelley advises, and I think it is a good thing, is to use a trusted, spiritually mature person in the congregation to try to find out what the real cause of the anger is. A person can go to him and say, I understand that what you're trying to say about our Sabbath school classes, and I understand what you're driving at and what you're trying to accomplish, but it really seems to me that your anger, that problem didn't merit somebody being as mad as you're mad as you were. Is there something else the matter? Now, you, as a person upon whom he initially vented that anger, can't really work that too well. You need to try to send somebody else to talk to him, somebody that's mature enough to know when to keep their mouth shut. To just go and just phrase it something like what I've said. I just don't understand your reaction. Is there something else bothering you? Because almost always there will be. And I really think that knowing that the minister, they can vent their anger at the minister when the minister will not reject them, is very, very important to people. So we've got to be pretty careful not to abuse that trust and not to overreact to it and not to destroy in people a lot of the confidence that they have in us. In the worldwide Church of God, people were denied that outlet because there the minister might very well reject them. And that rejection could take the form of cutting them off from all their friends and cutting them off from their family and having enormous consequences in their life. But in this church, that doesn't happen to them. And so like in many other churches, they will come to you to vent their anger because they know that you are committed to taking it. So maybe sometimes you can afford to take a little bit of anger and absorb a little bit of hostility, but at the same time, this is where having other people to help you absorb that hostility is so critical, so very critical. If you have to absorb it all by yourself, it will eat your lunch. But if you can share it with other people, use them as a heat sink, as anyone who's worked with electronic equipment will understand what that is. That's a device you clamp on between the soldering iron and other sensitive equipment to keep the heat from the soldering iron from going right straight through and damaging something. You know, you got a lot of mature members in the congregation make good heat sink. You know, say, go listen to this guy, would you, Joe? Spend some time with him. Let him unburden himself. Ask him what's really eating on him and see what you can find out. Let him absorb all that heat for a while. Don't try to do it all yourself. It'll eat you up. Having done that, you need to consider concrete criticisms seriously. You know, if somebody gets down to something where they've come to you and they've talked to you personally, and it is concrete, it's not abstract, it's not something like, well, you're too authoritarian, but where it is really dealing with something concrete, you really need to think about that. And the next thing you need to be sure you do is to consider the criticism calmly, not emotionally. And you need to put off consideration of it if you have to until you can consider it calmly. He says never deal with a criticism on the day it is received. Good advice. Good advice. Think about it. Sleep on it. He also says, and I've already mentioned this, don't shoulder the load alone. Just don't try to carry it all around by yourself. You can refer some criticism to local council. Someone comes to you all upset about something, I'll tell you what you ought to do. Why don't you go talk to some of the members of the council about that? Just send him down their way. Let him talk to them. There are some questions raised that the council can't deal with, but the ministerial council can. Now, you've done something that you know is right. Church policy. For example, you've decided that you're going to require anybody who's going to give a sermon or a sermonette in your church to wear a jacket and a tie. Now, we discussed that at ministerial council, and all the ministers felt that we should do that, and you've decided the time has come in your church for all the people to do that. And you announce that to all the people who are going to be giving sermonettes or leading in songs. I want you from now on, fellows, to wear a jacket and a tie. And somebody gets all upset about it and starts challenging it. Tell you what you do. Why don't you write a letter to Mr. Dart and make your appeal to the ministerial council because it was their decision, not mine. We're just trying to cooperate and be a part of the church. Just pass it on down our way. We're used to it. It comes about all the time. But see, there are all sorts of things where you are just simply trying to keep in touch and in step with the church at large everywhere and just trying to be subject to the ministerial council. There are a lot of policies that we have that the ministerial council, I didn't set them, Ted didn't set them, and you didn't set them. The ministry did. Okay? The question boils down, are we going to go along with the ministry or are we going to do our own thing? You can do your own thing, but let's all acknowledge that that's what you're doing. You know, we all pat every these people on the head and say, you are independent. You're an independent soul. You want to be independent? Be independent. But don't pretend that you are not. And that's what some people want to do. They want to pretend that they are in with the Church of God International while they still want to have things their way. Well, I don't object to you having things your way at all. I object to you having things your way and claiming that they're not. You know, so basically, you know, here's what we are. Here's where we're going. And if you all want to go with us, as we say to everybody, you're welcome. And if you don't want to go with us, we understand. We'll love you anyway. And if you'd like to catch up with us later, feel free. Just real easy in working with people. So don't shoulder the load alone. Use your counsel. Use the ministerial council. Use the whole ministry. Send them down the road to where your fellow ministers say, if you don't think I know what I'm talking about, go talk to Charlie. You know? Or if you don't believe me, you know, call Alan. And if you won't believe Charlie and Alan, well, let's call somebody else, but just, you know, do whatever you need to do. Don't carry it all by yourself. You don't have to, and there's no need for it, and it'll eat you up. Talk to people. Share these things with your fellow ministers. Next, complete your consideration of the criticism. What does that mean? It means don't let it sit back there in the back of your mind that you're going to get to it one of these days. Because that's another thing that will eat you up. Get to it, deal with it, and finish it within a very reasonably short period of time so you can put it behind you. Get finished with it. Either accept it and correct it, set yourself straight, or look at it and think it was unjustified and lay it aside and forget it. But whatever you do, don't let it sit there and eat on you. The leader who takes no cue from his people is a dictator. The leader who tries to satisfy every critic will gain no respect from anybody. Two opposite sides of a concept. One is you listen to everybody that criticizes you, and you try to respond to all the critics and everybody who considers, oh, well, here's John again. Old John's a doormat. You know. But on the other side, if John doesn't listen or take his cue from his people, he's nothing but a dictator. What does all this mean? It means that you need to look at the church as a whole, and you need to take your cue from them as to what is expected and what they're hoping for. It's what I talked about before. Look at these people, understand these people, and respect Christ in the congregation, because God will lead us all together if we will let him. We don't have to carry the burden of doing all the leading all by ourselves. Shelley said a pastor's authority depends on two ingredients. One, God's call and appointment. Two, the respect of the church. Lose either, he said, and you are finished. Do you agree with that? I don't see how you could disagree. You know, your authority as a pastor depends on God's call and his appointment. And secondly, the respect of the people. If God's not behind you, you're dead. And if the people don't respect you, you're dead. So those are things you've got, you know, that's something you have to pay attention to and have to work on. Next, when is it time to confront? There does come a point in time when you have just got to confront the dragon. You've got to go in and beard him in his lair, as it were. First of all, what are we trying to accomplish when we decide the time has come to confront? We are not trying to suppress differences of opinion. That would be stupid. We are not trying to silence complaining. That's just as equally stupid. We are trying to protect the church and, incidentally, the dragon from the destructive effect of their behavior. That is our objective. It is to analyze that if this continues, it is going to hurt people, and therefore I must do something, I must confront, and the objective of it is to protect the church and the dragon from the destructive effects of their own behavior. Now, what kind of an attitude do you go in confronting? He brings out at this point, and I quote, something that I had seen already myself, often the greatest damage is not done by the dragons themselves, but by the overreactions they provoke in other people. And that is true. We've got three big old asterisks by that, and we all need to remember it, that you can actually yourselves do more damage by overreacting than the dragon himself could do if you absolutely ignored him. So be very careful with that one. If you feel threatened or defensive or upset, it is not the time to confront. Not when you feel threatened, not when you feel defensive. You have got to, first of all, sort yourself out. Wait. You will be trying to put out a fire with gasoline again if you don't. The next thing that you have to consider, and this is really true in confronting, you have to go in with love, what Shelley calls smart love. And you have to accept the dragon as a person of worth. A person of worth. I don't care who they are. The one thing that I think this book did more to change in me, and it was, in some ways it is a subjective change rather than an objective change, it is that the realization that everybody in the church is worth saving. Everybody's worth saving. That there is no one in the church should ever be sacrificed if we, on behalf of some imagined goal that we are headed toward. The 99 can be left. I mean left. While you go after the one lost sheep. And sometimes that is what has to be done. Everyone in the church is worth saving. You do not sacrifice one individual for the well-being of the church. And this is, as I pointed out yesterday down in Woodruff, one of the most fundamental differences between us and the worldwide Church of God. The worldwide Church of God will sacrifice an individual for what it perceives to be the welfare of the church. We do not believe in that. No, the collection of individuals can take care of themselves. They are not to be, you're not to sacrifice one person on their behalf. So, any dragon is to be considered a person worth saving. And we should make every effort and enlist all aid in trying to do so if we can. He lists also the 3 P's of conflict management. 1, permission. That is, you are permitted to disagree. It's got to be something that exists in our family. It's got to be considered in our family, the church, and in the conversation when the time comes to confront. It's got to be there that the person has permission to disagree. Second, potency. In other words, everyone present when the confrontation comes about must be allowed to express his position with strength and with clarity, not being intimidated, or kept from it in any way. And third P is protection. No one will be intentionally hurt, nor will anyone be allowed to inflict needless hurt. The 3 Ps of conflict management. So when the conflict arises, this is something you need to explain to everybody concerned. It's all right to disagree. We got permission to disagree. You have the potency or the power to express. You will be allowed to express yourself completely and forcefully if you wish. And no one will be allowed to hurt anybody intentionally. If we hurt somebody, it will certainly be unintentional. Next, prior to confrontation, don't just pray about, but pray for the dragon. Something that has occurred to me, really, and I've often thought a lot about prayer. There are many unanswered questions in my mind about prayer. But I was struck in my own life recently of how difficult it was to maintain a line of unworthy thought while I was in an attitude of prayer and drawing near to God. And I began to realize sometimes I wonder if really it is the results that prayer is aimed at as much as it is the alteration in your own mind. I would think that when you are told to pray for your enemy, and we get on our knees and we start praying for our enemy, that an attitude of hatred would be difficult to maintain. Should be difficult to hold on to through the prayer experience. Now, of course, God knows what's going on in your mind all the time anyway, doesn't he? And he knows what your needs are before you ever ask him. Why then does he expect you to ask him? Why then has God, when he knows everything and could order things without any prayer at all, decided that there are some things he will not do until he's asked, and then he will respond? And he doesn't always respond every time because he wants you to persevere in prayer. I think the answer lies in the effect that prayer has on you. In other words, he has decided to do something that's almost artificial in a way, and that is not respond where he sees a need and would even want to do it until he is asked, and sometimes until he is asked more than once because of the change that prayer works in you. It's a thought. So don't just pray about them, but pray for these people before you confront. And when the time of confrontation comes, you are going to have to be gentle and firm at the same time. One of the toughest balances any of us will ever enter into. Frankly, I'm afraid that the thing you and I probably all need to work hardest on is gentleness, to be sure that we never err on that side. I would rather be too gentle and not firm enough than too firm and not gentle enough, and that's something that we all have to change on if we've been in an atmosphere that created a different kind of approach. The atmosphere for confronting is very critical. Timing is of the essence. You have to wait sometimes until the time is right, and you need to choose the time and try not to have it chosen for you so that it's the best situation possible. Location for confronting is critical because there are some environments that can be very threatening. The time to confront a dragon is not, the place is not necessarily in your office if you had one, or a study if you had one, as I've often done, with a desk between the two of you. Of course, I was taught that very early, that even if you have them in your office, you need to get up and go around to the other side and sit down with them. But even better than that is say, hey, let's meet over someplace in a restaurant in a quiet corner and have a cup of coffee and let's talk about this and get on neutral ground. Criticism has to be accompanied by a compliment. Rule, just write it down as a way of life, that you will make a resolution, I will never criticize. In the first step of confrontation really should be private. It should be personal and it should be private. Later on, you are going to, if you don't make the ground, if something really starts getting critical, you may have to have a witness. But at first, it needs to be private. Every criticism has to be accompanied by a compliment. Rule, just write it down as a way of life, that you will, make a resolution, I will never criticize or offer an item of criticism until I have first offered an item of compliment, an item of praise. Now, when you get to the place where witnesses become involved, at that point in time, start taking notes and inform the council. These are things you have to do when you've gone to that private meeting and the thing hasn't worked, and now you know you're going to have to take a witness with you. At that point in time, you've just got to start taking notes, because everything you say can and will be twisted and used against you in many cases. You just have to realize that. So the witness becomes critical, your notes become critical, and it's also important that, as a gesture of respect for the people you have to work with on that council, that you let them know what's coming down before somebody blindsides them with the whole thing. So it does sometimes have to take place. What do you do when there is no resolution? Because there are going to be times when there are not. Well, the first thing you do is you give it time and you leave it alone. Give it time and leave it alone. If somebody's decided to go off and meet somewhere, tell them you still love them, and that if they need you, call, that if you can be of any help you wish to, and just be kind and say, we don't want to bother you or anything, but if we can help, let us know. Give it time. Secondly, keep on being a minister, a servant of God's people. Don't ever let somebody cause you to quit being a servant of God's people because you've been a little bit bruised by a conflict that you've gotten involved in, or because you've been rejected by some thankless person at some point in time. You keep on serving and ministering to God's people. If you believe that God called you, don't ever turn that calling loose, whatever you do. So just keep on being a minister. And third, and this is something to even starting now, not when there is no resolution of the problem, let your moderation be known to all men. The word in the Greek probably should be gentleness or kindness. We all need to work at making kindness a dominant feature of our ministry. Gentleness. Moderation doesn't really say very much. One of the greatest ministers of God's people to ever walk the face of the earth was a man named Moses, and we are told he was more meek than any of the people that he was serving. Jesus Christ himself was a man who had a great deal of meekness. No, the strength was there when it was called for, but he was a very kind and a very gentle person. And that's the sort of pattern that all of us should do our best to emulate. And if you'll believe it, we've gotten to the end of 18 pages of notes in the 4 hours. Would any of you like to make any comments or have any questions about the things that we have gone over here today before I, let's say, engage in some summarizing remarks? Or are you all still going to have to digest it a while before you have anything to say about it? Okay. In going over all these things and thinking about them, and with all the experiences that I've had in the church, I'm very sad in a lot of ways that some of the concepts that I've talked about here today that we didn't tumble to a little earlier than we have. However, I am also grateful for the fact that a lot of the concepts that we are going over today, we have tumbled to in the past 5 years. There are certain things that we did not know 6 and 7 years ago. When we started out on the track that we're now going in the Church of God International, there were things then that we did not know that we have picked up along the way. And a lot of things that Shelley tells me in this book, I nod my head sagely and say, yeah, I've learned that. And I can see the truth of that, and I can see the wisdom of that, and I could add some examples to his examples to show how it is that we have come to learn that. A lot of us have the scars and the bruises and the hurt feelings and maybe a few smoldering resentments to show for some of the lessons that we have learned along the way. But I guess I can summarize what I'm trying to say is that the most important thing I think that I learned from this book is the fact that we are not somehow spiritually sick because we have problems in our churches. That we're just normal people, and we're fighting a battle that all sorts of people just like us have had to fight before, and we'll all have to fight them again, and that just because, we can maybe do things a little better, one of the things we try to do when we have problems is we try to restructure, or we try to reorganize. But really, that's not the solution to the problem. You can sort out some of your difficulties that way. You can head off a few things, but you see, one of the things that he tried to explain to us in the book, and that I try to explain to the ministry along the way, is that it's often not enough to rationalize the things that you are doing. By rationalize, I mean put it down on paper and organize it and draw up charts and all that type of thing. There is an emotional need that must be met There is an emotional need in the church kind of at large, and there are emotional needs in all of us as individuals. We have very common needs among all of us, and then we have individual needs that some of us have and others of us don't. The minister has the absolutely impossible task of trying to discern what those needs are and try to do what he can to meet those needs. But as I say, it's an impossible task, and it really is, because the only way those needs can ultimately be met is by Jesus Christ, because he is the one to whom these people must look. And it's only in continually pointing people to him, continually reminding people that this is his church, continually reminding people that Jesus himself was very tolerant of the weak, very tolerant of people who had problems and bad attitudes, very tolerant of people who had been bruised and hurt, very patient and very gentle with all these people, and that he was not willing that any should perish, but that all should have everlasting life. You know, as time goes by, I think we can grow and build a tradition of working together more effectively. I really do. I believe there is much that we could do that we have not done. I think we have made some mistakes along the way and have hurt one another and in the process, but we have learned from them. We unfortunately have had a few people give up along the way. And maybe if we can find some of those people and maybe retrace our steps, we can save some of them even yet if we just spend a little time trying to win them back. But you know, of all of the things of the ministry that Jesus Christ himself came with and that he has passed on to us, perhaps the dominant theme is it is a ministry of reconciliation. And our reconciliation, of course, must first be with God. But the alienation, to whatever degree we have alienation from other people who are our brethren, may be an indication of an alienation that still exists between us and God. And that total reconciliation of me and Jesus Christ and you and Jesus Christ somehow has to end in a reconciliation between me and you. Reconciliation. There are some barriers that have been built so high that I don't believe any man will ever be able to surmount them. The barriers that exist between Ted and his father is a very sad one in case. I doubt if anyone could ever surmount that barrier, although, you know, if Ted and his father could meet, it might dissolve in a minute, who knows. The barriers that exist between some of you, perhaps, in a ministry you knew in the Worldwide Church of God, may never be surmounted because of what has happened and what was done. The barrier between you and some member in the Worldwide Church of God, some of their attitudes towards some of us, may never be resolved. You can't do anything about some of those. But what you can do is take a look at those alienations and those opportunities for reconciliation that are at hand. And those you can do something about. And I think that if God looks down on us and he sees that we are trying and doing our best with the ones we can do something about, then he'll be patient with us when it comes to some of the others that we can't do so much about.